This is the essence of our community and the very foundation of our society.
The meeting seemed routine until King Charles stood to speak. His carefully rehearsed words contained a shocking directive that would strip Camilla of major royal duties without warning. Sitting just feet away, the Queen Consort was blindsided as her role was publicly diminished before palace advisors. No explanation, no private conversation, just a devastating decree that would shatter trust and leave the monarchy reeling. A shift in the palace. The morning arrived at Windsor Castle wrapped in the kind of silence that feels deliberate. Winter had settled over the grounds with a heaviness that matched the mood inside the ancient stone walls. Frost clung to the windows like a warning, and the sky hung low and gray above the towers. Inside, the palace stirred with its usual routines, but something felt different. The air itself seemed to carry a weight that the staff could sense but not name. Camilla had woken early that morning with an unshakable feeling of unease. She moved through her morning rituals slowly, pausing often as if trying to catch hold of a thought that kept slipping away. Her tea grew cold on the bedside table while she stood at the window staring out at the frozen gardens. Everything looked normal. Everything felt wrong. Charles had been distant for weeks now, not in an obvious way that she could point to or complain about. He still attended dinners. He still kissed her cheek in the mornings, but there was something missing behind his eyes, a preoccupation that he would not share. When she asked if something troubled him, he brushed her concerns aside with practiced ease. He smiled and changed the subject. He reassured her that all was well, but Camilla had known him too long to be fooled by surface gestures. She had learned over the years to read the subtle signs of his inner turmoil, the way he held his jaw a little tighter, the way his gaze would drift during conversations, as though he were solving problems in his head that he could not speak aloud, the way he retreated into paperwork and meetings, using duty as a shield against intimacy. All of these signs had been present lately, growing stronger with each passing day. That morning, advisors had been summoned for what was described as a routine meeting. The schedule had listed it as a standard briefing, nothing more. But Camilla noticed the unusual number of senior officials gathering in the corridors. She saw the tight expressions on their faces as they filed into the conference room. These were not the relaxed faces of men attending a routine discussion. These were the faces of people bracing for impact. She was expected to attend as well. Her presence at such meetings had become normal over the years, a symbol of her position and her partnership with Charles. She had earned her place at the table through decades of service and support, but as she walked toward the meeting room that morning, each step felt heavier than the last. The feeling of unease that had woken her now bloomed into something closer to dread. The palace hallways seemed longer than usual. Portraits of previous monarchs stared down from the walls with knowing expressions, as though they had witnessed this kind of moment before. The thick carpets muffled her footsteps, making her journey feel dreamlike and surreal. Staff members she passed offered polite nods but avoided her eyes. Did they know something she did not? Or was she imagining the tension in their faces? When she reached the doorway of the conference room, she paused. Through the partially open door, she could see Charles already seated at the head of the table. His posture was rigid, formal in a way that felt rehearsed. His hands were folded on the table before him, and his expression was carefully neutral. He looked like a man about to deliver news he had practiced saying but dreaded speaking aloud. Camilla took a breath and stepped inside. The room fell into a deeper silence as she entered, eyes turned toward her briefly before looking away. She took her usual seat, her heart beating faster than it should. Whatever was about to happen, she understood in that moment that it would change everything. The winter morning outside seemed to press against the windows, as cold and unforgiving as the atmosphere in the room. The announcement. Charles rose from his seat with the kind of deliberate slowness that signals importance. The room responded instantly, falling into an expectant hush. Every advisor straightened in their chair, every eye fixed on the king. Camilla watched her husband with growing apprehension, noticing the way his shoulders seemed to carry an invisible burden. His face wore the mask he reserved for state matters, carefully composed and emotionally distant. He began speaking in measured tones, his voice steady but lacking its usual warmth. The words came out rehearsed, as though he had practiced them alone in his study during the sleepless hours before dawn. He spoke of the monarchy's need to evolve. He mentioned public expectations and the weight of tradition balanced against modern demands. The language was formal, almost bureaucratic, creating a strange distance between speaker and listeners. Then came the directive itself. Charles announced a restructuring of ceremonial roles within the royal household. He framed it as a necessary step toward streamlining duties and preparing for future transitions. The words sounded reasonable on the surface, carefully chosen to seem logical and forward-thinking. But as he continued, the true nature of the announcement began to emerge from beneath the diplomatic phrasing. Buried within the careful language was a stunning revelation. Certain major duties currently held by the Queen Consort would be reassigned. Key ceremonial responsibilities that Camilla had undertaken for years would now be distributed among other members of the royal family. Her presence at specific state functions would no longer be required. Her role in certain charitable patronages would be reduced. The specifics were delivered in dry administrative terms, but their meaning was unmistakable. Camilla felt the words land like physical blows. Her face remained composed through years of trained discipline, but inside she was reeling. She had received no warning, no private conversation to prepare her for this public diminishment. Charles had not looked at her once since beginning his announcement. He kept his gaze fixed on the middle distance, as though addressing the room at large rather than speaking to individuals who would be affected by his words. The advisors around the table absorbed the news in shocked silence. No one moved. No one dared to glance toward Camilla to gauge her reaction. The tension in the room grew thick enough to choke on. These were experienced courtiers who had witnessed countless royal dramas, yet even they seemed stunned by what they were hearing. A few shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Others stared at the papers before them as though the documents might offer some explanation for this unexpected turn. Charles continued speaking, adding details about implementation timelines and transition procedures. His voice never wavered. He maintained his authoritative tone throughout, giving no hint of the personal cost behind the decision. But those who knew him well could see the strain in the tight corners of his mouth, the rigid set of his jaw. This was not a man enjoying his exercise of power. This was a man forcing himself through an ordeal. When he finally finished, the silence that followed felt endless. No one seemed to know the appropriate response. No questions were asked, no objections were raised. The decree had been delivered from the throne, and there was no mechanism in place to challenge it in that moment. Camilla sat frozen in her chair, her hands gripped together in her lap beneath the table, where no one could see them trembling. Her mind raced with questions that had no immediate answers. Why had he done this? Why had he not spoken to her first? What had she done to deserve this public humiliation? But her face betrayed nothing. She had learned long ago how to suffer in silence while maintaining a perfect royal facade. The weight of humiliation. The meeting concluded with a formality that felt suffocating. Papers were gathered, chairs scraped against polished floors. Advisors rose and departed with unusual haste, eager to escape the uncomfortable atmosphere that had settled over the room like fog. No one lingered for the customary small talk that usually followed such gatherings. The silence spoke volumes that words could not. Camilla remained seated for several seconds after the others began to leave, her body refusing to obey the command to stand. She felt exposed and vulnerable in a way she had not experienced in years. Every eye that avoided hers felt like confirmation of her humiliation. Every advisor who hurried past without speaking reinforced the message that her status had fundamentally changed in the span of a single announcement. Finally, she forced herself to rise. Her legs felt unsteady beneath her, but she willed them to carry her with dignity. She would not give anyone the satisfaction of seeing her crumble. She had survived scandals and public hatred before. She had endured years of being cast as the villain in a story the world loved to tell. She had learned how to hold her head high when everything inside her wanted to collapse. She left the conference room without looking at Charles. She could not trust herself to meet his eyes in that moment. If she looked at him, she might break. If she looked at him, she might demand answers in front of witnesses. So she walked past him as though he were simply another piece of furniture in the room, her face a carefully maintained mask of composure. The palace corridors stretched before her like an endless maze. Her footsteps echoed off the high ceilings and ancient walls, each sound a reminder of how alone she felt. Staff members she passed seemed to materialize from nowhere and disappear just as quickly, as though they sensed her need for solitude. Or perhaps they had already heard what happened and wanted to avoid the discomfort of encountering her. She walked without destination at first, simply moving because staying still felt impossible. The familiar paintings and tapestries that lined the walls offered no comfort. The grand architecture that usually made her feel part of something important now felt like a prison. Every room held memories of duties she had performed, responsibilities she had shouldered, years of service that now seemed meaningless in light of what had just occurred. Her mind replayed the meeting over and over, searching for clues she might have missed. Had there been warnings she failed to notice? Had their recent distance been his way of preparing for this moment? The questions multiplied faster than answers could form. Each possibility felt worse than the last. The uncertainty was almost more painful than the public stripping of her duties. What hurt most was the method of delivery. If Charles had come to her privately, if he had explained his reasoning and asked for her understanding, she might have found a way to accept it. She might have even agreed that changes were necessary. But to blindside her in front of advisors, to reduce her role through official decree without warning, felt like a betrayal that cut deeper than any policy decision. She finally found herself in her private sitting room, a space that had always been her refuge within the palace walls. She closed the door behind her and leaned against it, allowing herself a moment to simply breathe. The composure she had maintained through the corridors finally began to crack. Her hands shook. Her vision blurred with tears she refused to let fall. For the first time in their decades together, Camilla wondered if Charles truly understood what he had done to her. The King's Burden. Charles remained in the conference room long after the last advisor had departed. He stood at the window with his hands clasped behind his back, staring out at the frost-covered grounds without really seeing them. The room felt cavernous in its emptiness, the silence pressing down on him with an almost physical weight. He had delivered his announcement with the authority expected of a king, but now that authority felt hollow and bitter. He had not slept properly in weeks. The decision had consumed him during countless sleepless nights, turning over and over in his mind like a puzzle with no satisfying solution. He had rehearsed the words until they lost all meaning, practicing in front of mirrors and empty rooms until his delivery became mechanical. But nothing had prepared him for the actual moment of speaking those words, while Camilla sat just feet away, unaware of what was coming. The way she had left the room haunted him already. That careful composure, that refusal to meet his eyes, that dignified exit that somehow conveyed more pain than tears ever could. He knew her well enough to understand what that composure cost her. He had seen behind her public mask often enough to know the woman who lived beneath it, vulnerable and sensitive despite her polished exterior. This decision had not come from anger or resentment. Charles felt no desire to punish Camilla or diminish her importance in his life. If anything, the choice had torn at him precisely because of how much he valued her. But forces beyond their personal relationship had been pressing on him for months. Forces that demanded action regardless of personal cost. The pressures had arrived from multiple directions, each one adding weight until he could no longer ignore them. Political advisors had presented carefully worded memorandums about public perception and approval ratings. Ministers had suggested that certain adjustments might ease tensions with Parliament. Polls and focus groups had been cited, statistics offered as evidence of necessary change. The word modernization had been repeated so often it had become a kind of mantra. There were other considerations as well, ones he could barely admit to himself. Concerns about his own health, about the need to begin transitioning certain responsibilities before circumstances forced, rushed decisions, worries about how the monarchy would be perceived in an increasingly skeptical age, the weight of history pressing down on him, reminding him that every choice he made would be judged by generations to come. He had tried to find alternatives. He had spent hours with his most trusted advisors, searching for solutions that might accomplish the necessary goals without causing Camilla such pain. But every option seemed to lead back to the same conclusion. The changes needed to be significant enough to be noticed and meaningful enough to matter. Symbolic gestures would not satisfy those demanding reform. The guilt sat heavy in his chest. He understood that his method had been cowardly. He should have gone to Camilla privately days or weeks ago. He should have explained the pressures he faced and asked for her understanding. He should have given her time to prepare, to process, to ask questions in the safety of their private quarters, rather than forcing her to maintain composure in front of others. But he had convinced himself that a private warning would only prolong her suffering. He had told himself that swift action would be kinder than drawn-out anticipation. In truth, he now realized, he had simply been afraid of her reaction, afraid of having to defend a decision he was not entirely sure was right, afraid of seeing the hurt in her eyes before it became inevitable. Charles turned from the window and looked at the empty chair where Camilla had sat during the meeting. He could still picture her face in that moment, when understanding dawned. That flicker of shock she had quickly suppressed. The memory would stay with him, he knew, joining the collection of regrets that accumulated over a lifetime of duty. A widening gulf. Camilla spent the remainder of the day in her private sitting room, a sanctuary that now felt more like exile. She had dismissed her lady-in-waiting with a polite but firm insistence on solitude. The young woman had hesitated at the door, her concern visible, but ultimately she had obeyed without question. Now Camilla sat alone in the chair by the fireplace, watching flames dance and flicker without really seeing them. Decades of memories pressed upon her consciousness, unwanted but unavoidable. She remembered the years of patience while Charles navigated his first marriage and its public dissolution. She recalled the endless criticism she had endured, the cruel headlines and vicious cartoons that painted her as the eternal villain. She had weathered all of it because Charles had asked her to, because she believed they would eventually find peace together. She had supported him through his mother's death and his ascension to the throne. She had stood beside him during the awkward early days of his reign, when commentators questioned whether he was too old or too set in his ways to be an effective monarch. She had learned her duties as queen consort with the same determination she had applied to every challenge in her life, refusing to let critics claim she was not up to the task. And for what? To be stripped of those duties without warning or explanation? To be reduced in status by the very man she had sacrificed so much to support? The questions circled through her mind like vultures, offering no comfort and no answers. The afternoon light faded into evening, and still Camilla remained in her chair. She heard the palace settling into its evening routines around her. Footsteps passed in distant corridors. Doors opened and closed. The ordinary business of royal life continued as though nothing had changed, even though her entire world had shifted on its axis. For the first time in their long relationship, Camilla felt a distance between herself and Charles that seemed impossible to bridge. They had weathered so many storms together, survived so much public scrutiny and private pain, but this felt different. This wound had been inflicted by his hand, deliberately and publicly. The hurt went deeper than any external criticism ever could. She wondered if he was thinking of her at all. Was he in his study, surrounded by papers and obligations, already moving forward with the changes he had announced? Or was he feeling any measure of the guilt he should feel? The uncertainty gnawed at her. In the past, she had always known where she stood with Charles. Even in difficult times, they had maintained a connection that transcended circumstances. Now that connection felt severed. The staff had learned quickly. She could tell by the way they moved through the palace, their voices slightly hushed, their movements more careful than usual. Palace servants were experts at sensing shifts in power and mood. They could read the temperature of royal relationships with an accuracy born from generations of service. By now, every person working within these walls would know that something significant had happened. Camilla imagined the whispered conversations in kitchens and corridors, the speculation about what had caused the king to issue such an order, the theories about whether this signaled deeper problems in the royal marriage. The pity in their eyes when they looked at her would be unbearable. She had worked so hard to earn respect rather than sympathy, and now she would be seen as diminished, reduced, set aside. Evening turned to night, and still Charles had not come to find her. That absence spoke louder than any words could. He was avoiding her, perhaps dreading the confrontation he knew must come. Or perhaps he simply did not care enough to face what he had done. Both possibilities felt equally devastating. The fire burned low in the grate, and Camilla finally allowed herself to acknowledge the fear beneath her anger. What if this was only the beginning? The story breaks. The news leaked within 48 hours, as palace news inevitably does. No institution, no matter how carefully guarded, can completely contain information that dozens of people possess. Whether through careless conversation or deliberate strategy, the details of Charles's directive found their way beyond Windsor's walls and into the hands of those who trade in royal secrets. The first headlines appeared online in the early morning hours, tentative at first, citing unnamed sources within the palace. By midday, every major newspaper had picked up the story. By evening, it dominated television news broadcasts across the nation and beyond. The words Queen Consort and Sidelined appeared together in headlines with a frequency that made palace officials wince. The media response was immediate and ravenous. Royal correspondents who had spent years cultivating palace contacts suddenly found their phones ringing constantly as editors demanded analysis and context. What did this mean for the monarchy? What did it suggest about the relationship between Charles and Camilla? Was this a sign of deeper dysfunction within the royal household? Speculation ran wild across every platform. Television pundits debated the implications with an intensity usually reserved for political scandals. Newspaper columnists penned passionate opinions both defending and condemning the king's decision. Social media exploded with theories ranging from plausible to absurd, each one shared and reshared until fact and fiction became impossible to distinguish. Some commentators framed the decision as a necessary modernization of an outdated institution. They praised Charles for having the courage to make difficult choices and adapt the monarchy to contemporary expectations. These voices argued that streamlining roles and responsibilities was long overdue, that the royal family needed to present a leaner, more efficient image to justify its continued existence. Others took a harsher view. They painted the directive as a cruel public humiliation of a woman who had already endured decades of criticism. Opinion pieces appeared with titles questioning whether Charles was repeating the mistakes of his past, whether he possessed the emotional intelligence required of a modern monarch. Comparisons were drawn to his treatment of Diana, fair or not, and old wounds were reopened in the name of current commentary. The tabloids were predictably merciless. They published photographs of Camilla looking somber at recent engagements, images that had seemed unremarkable when taken, but now were presented as evidence of marital strain. Body language experts were consulted to analyze every public interaction between the king and Queen Consort. Unnamed friends were quoted expressing concern for Camilla's well-being and shock at Charles's actions. Foreign press picked up the story with equal enthusiasm. American networks devoted segments to analyzing the British monarchy's latest drama. European newspapers ran features examining how other royal families handled similar transitions. The story took on a life beyond its original context, becoming a symbol of larger debates about tradition, gender, power, and institutional change. Inside the palace, the media frenzy created additional pressure on an already tense situation. Staff members found themselves fielding calls from journalists they had known for years, people asking questions they could not or would not answer. The communications office worked overtime crafting responses that said nothing while appearing to address concerns. Every statement was parsed and analyzed for hidden meanings. The official palace response was predictably measured. A brief statement was released confirming that adjustments to ceremonial duties were being implemented as part of ongoing efforts to ensure the monarchy's effectiveness and relevance. No mention was made of Camilla specifically. No acknowledgement was given to suggestions of personal conflict. The statement was designed to shut down speculation while actually fueling it through its very blandness. Charles received daily briefings on media coverage, each one more grim than the last. Approval ratings were discussed in hushed tones. The word crisis began appearing in memorandums. Political allies expressed quiet concern about how this distraction might affect other initiatives. The pressure that had motivated the original decision now intensified, creating a feedback loop of stress and scrutiny. For Camilla, watching her private pain become public entertainment was a special kind of torture. She had lived through media storms before, but this felt different. She was not just a character in someone else's drama. She was the central figure in a story about her own diminishment. The search for understanding. Camilla could no longer bear the isolation. 3 days had passed since the announcement. 3 days of avoiding Charles and wrestling with questions that multiplied in the silence. She needed answers, even if those answers brought more pain. The uncertainty had become worse than any truth could be. She reached out to Lady Margaret, a friend who had served in various royal households for decades and understood the inner workings of palace politics better than almost anyone. They met in a small sitting room far from the main corridors, away from curious eyes and listening ears. Margaret arrived with the discretion that came from years of navigating sensitive situations. The older woman listened without interruption as Camilla poured out her confusion and hurt. She spoke of the public humiliation, the lack of warning, the bewildering nature of Charles's actions. Margaret's face remained neutral, revealing nothing, but her eyes showed sympathy that words did not need to express. When Camilla finally fell silent, Margaret chose her words carefully. She suggested that decisions at this level were rarely simple or purely personal. She hinted at pressures from government officials and concerns about public perception that had been building for months. She mentioned delicately that Charles faced challenges Camilla might not be fully aware of, forces pushing him toward choices he might not have wanted to make. But Margaret could offer no definitive answers. She did not know Charles's true motivations any more than Camilla did. She could only speculate based on decades of observing how power operated within these ancient walls. Her reassurances felt hollow, kindly meant, but ultimately unsatisfying. Camilla also spoke with her private secretary, a loyal woman who had been with her for years. The conversation was more practical, focused on what the directive meant for Camilla's daily schedule and future engagements. They reviewed which patronages would be affected, which ceremonies she would no longer attend, what her revised role would look like in practical terms. Seeing it laid out in stark detail made the reduction feel even more real. Responsibilities she had taken seriously, causes she had championed, connections she had built over years of patient work, all of it diminished or reassigned. Her secretary maintained professional composure, but Camilla could see the anger simmering beneath the surface on her behalf. The question that haunted Camilla most was whether she should fight back. Did she have any power to challenge this decision? Could she appeal to Charles privately or even publicly push back against the changes? Her instinct was to resist, to refuse to accept this diminishment without protest. But every advisor she consulted counseled caution. Fighting the king's decree would create an even larger scandal. It would expose the rift between them to greater scrutiny and potentially damage the monarchy itself. She would be painted as difficult or power-hungry, unable to accept necessary change. The public sympathy she currently enjoyed might evaporate quickly if she was seen as putting personal status above institutional needs. Yet accepting the decision quietly felt like surrender. It meant acknowledging that her role could be redefined without her input, that years of service counted for nothing when weighed against other considerations. It meant living with the constant awareness that she held her position at Charles's pleasure and could be reduced further at any moment. Camilla felt trapped between impossible choices, challenge the decision, and risk destroying what remained of her relationship with Charles while damaging the institution they both served. Or accept it gracefully and watch her influence slowly fade until she became little more than a ceremonial figurehead, present but powerless. As evening approached, she realized that no conversation with advisors or friends could provide the answers she needed. There was only one person who could explain what had truly happened and why. She would have to face Charles directly. The truth emerges. Charles finally confided in Sir Edward, an advisor who had served the royal family for over 30 years and had earned a level of trust few others possessed. They met in the king's private study late in the evening, when the palace had settled into quietness and conversations could be held without fear of interruption. Charles looked older than his years, the weight of recent days visible in every line of his face. He spoke haltingly at first, struggling to articulate motivations that felt tangled and complicated even in his own mind. But gradually, with Sir Edward's patient listening, the full picture began to emerge. The decision had not been made lightly or cruelly. It had been the result of pressures that had been building for months, forces that Charles had tried to resist, until resistance became impossible. The Prime Minister had applied subtle but persistent pressure during their weekly meetings. Concerns about public spending and royal relevance had been raised repeatedly, always couched in diplomatic language, but carrying an unmistakable message. The government needed to show voters that the monarchy was adapting, becoming more streamlined and cost-effective. Symbolic changes were required to demonstrate responsiveness to modern expectations. Polling data had been presented showing declining support among younger generations. Focus groups revealed skepticism about the size and scope of the royal household. The message was clear: make changes now on your own terms, or face the possibility of changes being imposed later through political pressure or public demand. But there were more personal considerations as well. Charles revealed what few people knew. His doctors had expressed concerns during recent examinations. Nothing immediately alarming, but warnings about stress and the toll of his responsibilities at his age. Suggestions had been made about delegating more duties, about planning for transitions before circumstances forced hurried decisions. The restructuring of Camilla's role had been suggested as a way to begin that process. By redistributing certain ceremonial duties now, the transition could be gradual and controlled. It would set precedents for future adjustments and demonstrate that the monarchy could evolve smoothly. Charles had resisted the idea initially, understanding how it would affect Camilla, but the arguments had worn him down. He had convinced himself that the decision was protective in some way, that by making these changes now, he was preventing more drastic measures later, that by taking action while he still had control, he was safeguarding both Camilla and the institution. But hearing himself explain it aloud to Sir Edward, Charles recognized how flawed his reasoning had been. The greatest failure, he admitted, had been his silence. He had not told Camilla about the pressures he faced because he had wanted to shield her from worry. He had not discussed the decision with her beforehand because he had feared her pain and his own inability to defend choices he was not entirely sure were right. So he had acted alone, making a decision that affected her profoundly, without giving her any voice in the matter. Sir Edward listened without judgment, his expression grave but understanding. When Charles finished speaking, the older man remained silent for a long moment. Then he said what Charles already knew but needed to hear, that intentions, however good, did not excuse the method. That protection offered without consultation was not protection at all, but control. that Charles had wounded the person closest to him while trying to serve abstract concepts of duty and legacy. Charles knew what needed to happen next. He needed to face Camilla and tell her everything he had just revealed to Sir Edward. He needed to give her the explanation she deserved, even knowing that explanation might not be enough to repair the damage he had caused. The conversation he had been avoiding could be delayed no longer. Words that cannot be unsaid. Charles found Camilla in the blue drawing room the following evening. She sat near the window with a book open in her lap, though he suspected she had not read a single word. The room felt cold, despite the fire burning in the hearth, the chill coming not from temperature but from the emotional distance that had grown between them over the past week. She looked up when he entered, her expression guarded. For a moment neither of them spoke. The silence stretched taut between them, filled with all the words that had remained unspoken since that terrible morning in the conference room. Charles closed the door behind him, a signal that this conversation would be private, uninterrupted, and long overdue. He began with an apology, though the words felt inadequate before he even spoke them. He acknowledged that his method had been wrong, that he should have come to her first, that she deserved better than public blindsiding. Camilla listened without responding, her face revealing nothing. The composure she maintained was its own form of accusation. Then Charles began to explain. He told her about the political pressures, the meetings with the Prime Minister, the polling data that had been presented as evidence of necessary change. He described the delicate dance of trying to modernize an ancient institution while preserving its essential character. He spoke of the impossible balance between public expectation and private loyalty. Camilla's composure finally cracked. Her voice when she spoke was quiet but sharp with accumulated hurt. She asked why he had not trusted her with this information weeks ago. She questioned why he believed he needed to protect her from realities they should have faced together. She pointed out that by excluding her from the decision, he had made her look weak and disposable rather than protected. Charles tried to explain his reasoning, but hearing his own justifications spoken aloud made them sound hollow. He had told himself he was acting out of care, but Camilla was right. He had treated her like someone who needed management rather than a partner who deserved consultation. His protection had actually been a form of dismissal. The conversation grew more heated. Camilla revealed depths of hurt that Charles had not fully grasped. She spoke of feeling erased after years of building her role with patience and determination. She described the humiliation of learning about her reduced status in front of others. She asked whether this was the beginning of a pattern, whether she would wake up one day to find herself further marginalized without warning or explanation. Charles revealed his health concerns then, information he had been keeping even from Camilla. He explained the doctor's warnings and his own fears about the future. He admitted that the decision had been partly about establishing precedents for transitions that might become necessary sooner than either of them wanted to acknowledge. The confession shifted something in the room's atmosphere. Camilla's anger did not disappear, but it mixed with other emotions now. Concern for Charles, frustration that he had carried these worries alone, sadness that they had reached a point where he felt unable to share such fundamental concerns with her. She asked why he thought facing difficulties separately was preferable to facing them together, a question Charles could not adequately answer. They talked for hours as darkness deepened outside the windows. The conversation circled through anger, explanation, recrimination, and reluctant understanding. Neither of them emerged from it feeling entirely satisfied or resolved. Too much had been said that could not be unsaid. Too much damage had been done that could not be instantly repaired. But by the end, they had at least achieved clarity. Camilla understood the forces that had shaped Charles's decision, even if she could not forgive the method of its execution. Charles recognized the full extent of the wound he had inflicted, even if he still believed some version of the changes had been necessary. The path forward remained uncertain, but at least now they were facing it with honesty rather than silence. It was not reconciliation, not yet, but it was a beginning. A new reality. The weeks that followed the confrontation brought no dramatic resolution, only the slow adjustment to a reality that neither Charles nor Camilla had wanted. Life in the palace continued with its routines and rhythms, but the texture of their relationship had fundamentally changed. Trust, once fractured, could not be instantly rebuilt through good intentions alone. Camilla moved forward with quiet dignity. She attended the engagement still assigned to her with the same professionalism she had always demonstrated. If she felt diminished by her reduced schedule, she gave no public indication. The press watched her carefully for signs of distress or rebellion, but she offered them nothing. Her composure became a kind of silent protest, a refusal to be defined by what had been taken from her. Privately, she made a decision that brought her a measure of peace. She would not fight to reclaim what had been removed. Fighting would only prolong the pain and deepen the public spectacle. Instead, she would focus her energy on the responsibilities that remained, investing them with greater purpose and attention. If her role was smaller, she would make it more meaningful. Charles attempted repairs in the ways available to him. Small gestures of consideration and affection, efforts to include Camilla in discussions he might previously have handled alone. He could not undo his decision without appearing weak and creating additional chaos, but he could demonstrate through daily actions that he valued her presence and partnership. Whether these gestures were enough remained an open question. The monarchy moved forward into its new configuration. Other family members absorbed the duties that had been reassigned, some more gracefully than others. The public gradually absorbed the changes, their attention moving on to newer scandals and concerns. The restructuring that had seemed so momentous in its immediate aftermath became simply another adjustment in the long history of an institution built on tradition and transformation. Staff members noticed the subtle shifts in dynamics. The easy warmth that had previously characterized interactions between Charles and Camilla had been replaced by something more careful and deliberate. They were cordial, respectful, even affectionate at times, but a space existed between them now that had not been there before. Yet there were moments that suggested healing remained possible. A shared glance during a state dinner that held genuine connection. A private conversation in the garden that lasted longer than duty required. Small instances of the partnership they had built over decades reasserting itself despite the damage. The future remained unwritten. Camilla had not forgiven Charles completely, and perhaps never would. The hurt he had caused left marks that time might fade, but never fully erase. Charles lived with the knowledge that he had wounded someone he loved, in the name of principles and pressures that seemed less compelling in hindsight. But they continued forward together, bound by decades of history and the commitments they had made. The crown sat heavy on Charles's head. Camilla's place beside him felt different now, smaller but somehow more clearly defined. Neither had gotten what they wanted, but both were learning to live with what remained. If you enjoyed this video, like and subscribe, and also click the next video shown on your screen.